I walked into my Chicago penthouse just before midnight and found 3 suitcases lined up beside my dining table. My husband looked at me and calmly said, "My parents live here now." Why had no one told me? Why had 3 permanent access codes been activated while I was still on my flight? And why was my smart home system warning me that someone had requested administrator control as my father-in-law smiled and called the place our home? I opened the security dashboard on my phone. The access log showed the changes had started hours before I landed. I didn't argue. I simply disabled every new access code before anyone realized I had taken back control. Before I tell you what happened after that night, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If stories about family boundaries and quiet justice are your kind of stories, consider subscribing so you won't miss what comes next. The next morning began so quietly that for a moment I almost convinced myself I had overreacted. Then I walked into my own kitchen. Carol McDonald was rearranging my coffee station without asking. My espresso machine, the one I'd spent weeks researching before buying, had been moved to the opposite counter because she said it looked better there. My ceramic mugs had disappeared into different cabinets. A family photo of Lucas and me from our anniversary trip to Maine had been replaced with a framed picture of Thomas and Carol holding hands at Yellowstone. No one had asked if I was comfortable with any of it. "Good morning, sweetheart," Carol said with a warm smile that would have looked genuine to anyone who didn't know her. "I hope you don't mind. I just wanted to make this place feel a little more like home." "Home?" She said the word so naturally that it made my stomach tighten. I looked at Lucas. He poured himself coffee without meeting my eyes. "I figured Mom was just keeping busy," I answered calmly. "She isn't keeping busy." Both of them looked at me. "She's redecorating my home." Carol laughed softly. "Oh, Alina, don't make it sound so dramatic. Families adjust. That's what healthy families do." I didn't respond. Arguing over a coffee machine wasn't the point. I had spent my entire career learning that when someone wanted access to a secure system, the first signs were almost never dramatic. They started with small, seemingly harmless changes. A new permission, an overlooked account, a device no one questioned. People tested boundaries before they crossed them. The same principle applied to people. I made breakfast in silence while Thomas walked in wearing one of Lucas's old sweatshirts, as though he'd been living there for years. "Morning," he said. "I was thinking the guest room gets much better sunlight than the room we're using. We'll probably switch today." "We'll probably switch." Not, "Would that be okay?" Not, "Can we, just a decision." I looked at him. "I'm not moving furniture." Thomas smiled. "You won't have to." He took another sip of coffee. "I'll hire someone." Lucas chuckled nervously. "Dad likes staying organized." I watched all 3 of them. No one seemed to notice how completely the conversation ignored the fact that this was my home. Or maybe they noticed. Maybe they had simply decided my opinion mattered less. When I arrived at my office downtown, I closed my door before opening the administrative dashboard for my penthouse. Everything was cloud-based. Every smart lock, every elevator credential, every garage access credential, every security permission. I exported the previous week's activity log. Normally, I never checked it. Now I read every line. At 11:12 a.m. yesterday, Lucas had created a permanent access code. 11:18, another. 11:26, a third. At 12 USU Obo 4. He elevated one of those accounts so it could unlock every residential entrance. At 12:19, someone attempted to create a secondary administrator profile. The request failed because my account required biometric approval. Mine, not Lucas's. I stared at the screen longer than I wanted to admit. The timestamps mattered. I had boarded my flight at 10:45. Lucas hadn't waited until I landed. He hadn't called me. He hadn't texted me. He had intentionally completed everything while I was thousands of feet in the air. That wasn't impulse. That was planning. I exported the logs as encrypted PDFs and stored duplicate copies in 3 separate locations. Old habit. Evidence disappears more often than people expect. Around 11, Lucas called. "Are you still upset?" "I'm working." "I know, but I wanted to explain." "I'm listening." "My parents sold their house." "I know. They need somewhere stable." "I understand." "So why are you acting like they're trying to steal something?" His question hung in the air, because I hadn't accused anyone of stealing. Not once. I simply answered, "I don't like people making permanent decisions about my home without asking me. They're family." "So am I." Silence. Then he sighed. "You always make everything sound like a contract." "No." I leaned back in my chair. "I make everything sound like consent." He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "This doesn't have to become a legal issue." I didn't say it was. "Then why did you disable their codes?" Because someone had tried to create an administrator account. Because the changes were planned before my flight. Because nothing about this felt temporary. Instead, I simply said, because they weren't authorized. Lucas sounded frustrated. "They're my parents. And this is my property." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he quietly ended the call. That afternoon, I received another notification. Building management. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "Good afternoon, Miss McDonald," Marcus Hill said politely. Marcus had managed the building since before I'd purchased the penthouse. He knew every owner personally. "I just wanted to verify something." "What is it?" "We received paperwork requesting that 2 additional permanent residents be added to your unit." I kept my voice even. "I didn't submit anything." "I thought so." He paused. "The application was signed by Mr. Lucas McDonald." My fingers tightened around my phone. Yesterday afternoon. Yesterday, the same day I was flying home, Marcus continued. "I haven't approved anything yet because ownership records indicate the residence belongs to McDonald Technology Holdings, LLC. "My LLC." "Exactly. The request requires authorization from the managing member." "Which is me." "Correct." I thanked him and ended the call. For several moments, I simply stared through the office window toward Lake Michigan. Permanent residents, not temporary guests. Permanent. That single word changed everything, because adding permanent residents wasn't just about convenience. It established records, mail delivery, building credentials, emergency contacts, occupancy history. It created documentation that could later be used to support other claims. Individually, none of those records changed ownership. Together, they told a story. And whoever had prepared that application clearly understood how important stories could become when written into official records. I opened the exported access logs again. One timestamp suddenly caught my attention. Just 4 minutes after Lucas created the first permanent access code, someone had accessed the resident information portal from inside the penthouse. Not from Lucas's phone, not from mine. From the desktop computer in my home office. Only one person besides me had ever asked where that computer was. Thomas. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That always happened when something finally made sense. Fear faded. Pattern recognition took over. I wasn't looking at a family misunderstanding anymore. I was looking at coordinated steps. Each one seemed harmless on its own. Together, they pointed somewhere much bigger. Before I could call Marcus back, another email appeared in my inbox. Subject: Residency Application. Additional documentation requested attached beneath it was a scanned form with Lucas's signature already on the first page, and several blank sections waiting to be completed. I didn't open the attachment right away. Instead, I saved the email, downloaded the PDF, and stored copies in the same encrypted folder where I'd placed the access logs. Then I forwarded everything to my personal email and to Rachel Bennett, the real estate attorney who had helped me structure the LLC that owned my penthouse years before I married Lucas. Only after I had multiple copies did I read the document. It wasn't a lease. It wasn't a transfer of ownership. It was an additional residency verification form requested by the building's management system after someone applied to add permanent residents. The first page carried Lucas's signature. The second page was still blank. There were spaces for proof of identity, emergency contacts, mailing addresses, and declarations that the applicants intended to use the residence as their primary home. I read that last sentence 3 times. Primary home. Those 2 words echoed louder than anything else on the page. If Thomas and Carol were simply staying with us for a few weeks, why would anyone need paperwork describing my penthouse as their primary residence? I closed my laptop. Something about this felt carefully planned but not yet complete. Whoever started this process was waiting for the remaining documents. I intended to make sure they never arrived. Marcus agreed to meet me during my lunch break. The management office occupied a quiet corner of the building's lobby. It smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint, and Marcus greeted me with the same professionalism I'd always appreciated. "I figured you'd want to see everything yourself," he said. He placed a thin file on the conference table. "This is all we've received." I opened it. The application had been submitted online. Lucas's digital signature appeared exactly where Marcus had described. The applicants listed beneath it were Thomas McDonald and Carol McDonald. Date submitted 3 weeks ago. I looked up. 3 weeks. Marcus nodded. It was incomplete, so our system automatically requested additional documentation. Why didn't anyone contact me? We assumed your husband was coordinating it with you. I gave him a small smile that probably looked more relaxed than I felt. He wasn't. Marcus sighed. I'm sorry. I wasn't angry with him. From his perspective, nothing illegal had happened. A resident had submitted an incomplete request. The building had asked for more information. The process had paused. Still, 3 weeks. Lucas had started this before either of his parents packed a suitcase, before they unexpectedly lost their home, before he ever mentioned they might stay with us. That wasn't a spontaneous family emergency, that was preparation. Marcus opened another file. There's something else. He slid a printed log across the table. Your mailroom profile. I scanned the page. A request had been submitted asking that mail addressed to Thomas and Carol McDonald be accepted for delivery to my penthouse. Status pending. Again. 3 weeks earlier. I exhaled slowly. Official mail, government correspondence, bank statements, insurance notices. Those documents didn't change ownership, but they created records. Records that established where someone lived. Marcus looked at me carefully. I thought it seemed unusual. So you didn't approve it? No. Why? He smiled slightly. Because your ownership file is different. He turned his monitor toward me. Owner McDonald Technology Holdings LLC. Managing member Alina McDonald. Additional residency requests. Managing member approval required. Marcus folded his hands. Without your authorization, nothing moves forward. For the first time that morning, I felt my shoulders relax. One safeguard still existed, and I intended to keep it that way. Rachel's office overlooked the Chicago River. She had represented executives, investors, and business owners for nearly 20 years, but one of the reasons I'd hired her was simple. She explained complicated legal issues in plain English. She read through every document without interrupting. Then she leaned back. First, she tapped the residency application. This doesn't give anyone ownership. I know, but don't underestimate it. I waited. She continued. Ownership and occupancy are different things. I understand that. Most people don't. She pointed to the application. If someone consistently establishes residency mail building records, emergency contacts utility history, it creates documentation. Documentation of what? That they genuinely live there. I frowned. But they still don't own it. Correct, she smiled. Think of ownership as the title to a car. I nodded. Occupancy is who drives it every day. They're different. Exactly. She folded the papers together. Individually, none of these documents threaten your ownership. I relaxed a little. Then she added, but when people build documentation over months instead of days, those records can become useful in completely different disputes. I looked at her. What kind of disputes? Divorce, estate matters, debt negotiations, claims of dependency, financial disclosures. She paused. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but someone is investing a surprising amount of effort into proving your penthouse is their permanent residence. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Rachel wasn't accusing anyone. She didn't need to. The documents were speaking for themselves. I don't want to confront Lucas yet, I said. I wouldn't. That answer surprised me. You wouldn't? No. Why not? Because right now you're gathering facts. She organized the papers into neat stacks. If you confront him today, whoever planned this has time to change course. And if I wait, you learn where the road was leading. Her advice matched the way I approached cybersecurity investigations. Never interrupt an intrusion too early. Sometimes watching the next move tells you more than blocking the first one. As Rachel scanned the final page, her expression changed. She reached for another document. This wasn't attached to your email. What is it? The change of address request. I leaned forward. Thomas McDonald, previous address. His old suburban home, new mailing address. My penthouse. Requested effective date. 2 weeks earlier. I turned the page. Carol had submitted the same request. Neither request had been completed because the postal verification hadn't been finalized. Rachel frowned. They've already started changing official records. I felt the first real knot form in my stomach. Not because they had succeeded, because they expected to. Rachel opened a legal database on her computer. Let's see if there's anything else. She searched Thomas McDonald's name. Most of the results involved his old construction company, business filings, contract disputes, property records. Nothing immediately alarming. Then one result caught her eye. Interesting. She clicked it. A recent filing showed Thomas had retained a financial advisory firm specializing in debt restructuring. Rachel looked at me. That alone isn't unusual, but they're expensive. People don't hire firms like this unless they're trying to protect or reorganize significant assets or liabilities. My penthouse isn't his asset. No. She held my gaze. But someone may want it to appear connected. Before I left, Rachel handed every document back to me. Keep copies. I always do. And one more thing. I stopped at the door. If anyone asks why you're reviewing these records, she smiled, don't explain. Why? Because people who think they're still ahead of you often reveal much more than people who know they've already lost. Driving home, I replayed every conversation I'd had with Lucas over the previous month. Every time he'd casually mentioned helping his parents. Every moment he'd asked whether we really needed such a large apartment. Every question about whether I planned to keep the LLC forever. At the time, they had sounded like ordinary conversations between spouses. Now they felt different. Not because the words had changed, because I finally understood the context around them. When I parked beneath my building, my phone vibrated. It was another email from the management office. The subject line was short. Additional resident documents received. I frowned. That shouldn't have been possible. Marcus had told me nothing could move forward without my approval. I opened the email. Only one new document had arrived. It wasn't identification. It wasn't proof of insurance. It was a bank letter listing my penthouse as Thomas McDonald's residential mailing address. For several seconds, I simply stared at the bank letter on my phone. The address was unmistakable. My penthouse. The account number had been partially redacted, but the sender was a nationally recognized bank. The letter acknowledged that Thomas McDonald had updated his mailing address and that future correspondence would be delivered to my building. Not his old house, not a temporary mailbox. My home. I immediately called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. I was about to call you. I just received the notification. So did I. How did another document get added? Marcus sounded almost embarrassed. It wasn't uploaded through the resident portal. What do you mean? It came directly from the applicant. So someone physically delivered it. Yes. I leaned against my car. When? This morning. Who? There was a brief pause. Your father-in-law. I rode the elevator upstairs without turning on any music. The silence helped me think. Thomas hadn't waited for Lucas. He hadn't asked permission. He had personally walked into the management office carrying financial documents that connected himself to my address. That wasn't something people did casually. It required planning, confidence, and the expectation that no one would question it. When the elevator doors opened, I found Thomas standing on my balcony with a cup of coffee looking over the Chicago skyline as if he'd lived there for years. He smiled when he saw me. Beautiful view. It is. I've always liked high-rise living. I walked past him without responding. Inside, Carol was directing 2 movers. My bookshelf had been emptied. My books were stacked on the floor. Family photographs from Lucas's childhood had appeared where my travel souvenirs had been. I stopped. What is this? Carol looked genuinely surprised. Oh. She laughed softly. We're just making room. For what? Our things. Our. Again, that word. I looked at the movers. Who hired you? Thomas answered from the balcony. I did. With whose permission? He shrugged. I didn't think we'd need permission to rearrange furniture. Lucas walked in from the hallway carrying another box. I told Dad it wasn't necessary. But you still helped. He hesitated. I didn't think it was a big deal. I looked around my living room. Nothing expensive had been damaged. Nothing had been stolen. Yet somehow the apartment already felt unfamiliar. Not because of the furniture, because every decision had been made without me. That evening I stayed unusually quiet. People often assume silence means surrender. In cybersecurity, silence usually means data collection. While everyone watched television, after dinner I opened my laptop in the study. The home's internal network recorded far more than door locks. Every connected device left a trail: thermostats, garage entries, guest Wi-Fi, printer usage, even some voice assistant requests. I searched activity from the past month. Most of it was routine. Then one entry caught my attention. The guest Wi-Fi password had been requested 6 separate times, not by visitors, by Lucas. Each request had been followed by new device registrations. I expanded the device list: Thomas's laptop, Carol's tablet, Thomas's phone, Carol's phone, a wireless printer. I frowned. Printer. We didn't own a wireless printer. The registration date matched exactly 1 week before I left for my business trip. I searched further. The printer had connected only 3 times. Each session lasted less than 5 minutes. Long enough to print documents, not long enough for casual use. I wrote down the serial number. Around 9 o'clock, Thomas knocked on my office door. "You working?" "Yes." He smiled. "You spend too much time behind screens." "My job pays for those screens." He laughed. "You know, Lucas tells me you've always been very independent." I have. Sometimes independence makes people suspicious. I looked directly at him. Sometimes experience does. His smile faded just slightly. "You think we're trying to take something from you?" "I think people reveal their intentions through actions." "We're just family." "If that's true, then respecting boundaries shouldn't be difficult." Neither of us spoke. Finally, he nodded once. "You're very much like your father." That surprised me. He had met my father only twice. "What makes you say that?" "He never trusted anyone either." He walked away before I could answer. The comment stayed with me long after he left. It wasn't an insult. It was an attempt. People who manipulate often search for emotional shortcuts. If they can make you question yourself instead of questioning them, they've gained an advantage. I wasn't going to give Thomas that advantage. The next morning, I stopped by the building's package room before leaving for work. Marcus was waiting. "I found something you should see." He handed me a visitor log. "This isn't confidential." "It concerns your residence." I scanned the entries. Thomas had signed in multiple guests over the previous week. A financial consultant, an insurance agent, 2 people from a moving company. One name appeared twice, David Mercer, Occupation Financial Advisory Group. I looked up. "Did they meet in my unit?" Marcus nodded. "Conference room reservation wasn't requested." "So they met upstairs." "Looks that way." Thomas hadn't mentioned any of it. Neither had Lucas. I thanked Marcus and headed toward the elevator. Before the doors closed, he spoke again. "There's one more thing." I pressed the open button. "What?" "When Mr. McDonald checked in Mr. Mercer..." "Which one? Your father-in-law." Marcus glanced down at his notes. "He introduced himself to security as the homeowner." I didn't go straight to work. Instead, I parked near the river and called Rachel. "He told building security he owns my penthouse." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Did security believe him?" "No." "Good. But that's not the point." "I know." She sighed. People don't usually misrepresent something like that unless they expect others to accept it eventually. I looked out across the water. "So what are they building?" "I don't know yet." "But every document you've collected points in the same direction." The direction being they're creating consistency. "What does that mean?" "The residency forms, the mail, the visitors, the meetings, the introductions. They all tell the same story." She paused. "And stories become powerful when enough independent records repeat them." I felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. Not because Rachel sounded alarmed, because she sounded analytical. Exactly the way I did when explaining a sophisticated cyber attack. One failed login meant very little. 50 coordinated actions told you someone had a plan. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked quietly into the living room. Something looked different. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. Then I noticed the cabinet beneath the television. One drawer wasn't fully closed. Inside was a folded envelope. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't even addressed to Lucas. The front read, "Thomas McDonald, Mercer Financial Consulting, R.O." I hesitated. The envelope had already been opened. Several papers inside had shifted enough for one page to slide halfway out. I wasn't trying to search through Thomas's belongings. I simply glanced at the exposed page. One sentence was visible. Residential stability will strengthen the refinancing application. I carefully slid the paper back exactly as I'd found it. Then I quietly took a photograph of the visible page before closing the drawer. For the first time, I had written proof that Thomas's residency in my penthouse wasn't simply about having a place to sleep. It was connected to financing. But I still didn't know what asset he was trying so desperately to protect. I barely slept that night. Not because I was afraid, because my mind kept organizing pieces that didn't quite fit together. Thomas had changed his mailing address. He had applied to become a permanent resident. He had introduced himself as the homeowner. He had met with a financial consultant inside my penthouse, and now I had photographed a document stating that his residential stability would strengthen a refinancing application. Individually, none of those facts proved wrongdoing. Together, they suggested intention. By 7 the next morning, I was sitting across from Rachel Bennett again. She studied the photo on my phone before placing it beside the rest of the documents. "You did the right thing." "I didn't remove anything." "I'm glad." She smiled slightly. "Judges like facts more than emotions." "So do I." "I know." She arranged everything chronologically: the access logs, the residency application, the change of address requests, the visitor records, the bank letter, finally the photograph. For several minutes she said nothing. Then she circled 2 dates with a pen. "These matter." I leaned closer. The first date was the day Lucas submitted the residency application. The second was the day Thomas met David Mercer. Only 48 hours separated them. Rachel tapped the timeline. "This wasn't random. I've been thinking the same thing. Let's verify it." Rachel requested several public filings while I watched. Most business records were available online. Some required a small fee. Others took a few minutes to retrieve. Eventually, a corporate filing appeared on her screen. Thomas's former construction company, McDonald Structural Builders, status active. I frowned. "I thought Lucas said the business had been shut down." "So did I." Rachel kept scrolling. "It isn't operating the way it once did." "What does that mean?" "It still exists, but it's carrying debt." She opened another filing. Commercial loan renewal, pending, another. Business asset review, pending, then another. Debt restructuring consultation, pending. Rachel leaned back. "Now we're getting somewhere." She opened the state property database. I watched her search Thomas's name. Nothing. She searched the company's name. Still nothing significant. Then she searched David Mercer's firm. A list of recently filed commercial financing notices appeared. Rachel didn't smile. She became quieter. Whenever she got quiet, it usually meant she'd found something important. "Alina." "What? This doesn't directly involve your penthouse." My shoulders relaxed slightly. "But..." She rotated the monitor toward me. "The consulting firm specializes in refinancing businesses that don't have enough collateral." I read the firm's profile: commercial restructuring, asset preservation, debt negotiation, collateral optimization. I looked back at Rachel. "So Thomas needs additional financial strength." "That's my guess." "But he can't use my home." "No." She paused. "He can't." The emphasis mattered. Legally, he couldn't. But appearances sometimes influenced negotiations long before lawyers became involved. Rachel opened another document. This one hadn't come from a public database. It came from paperwork I had emailed earlier. The incomplete residency application. She pointed to one small section I hadn't paid attention to. Residence type. primary residence, secondary residence, temporary residence. Only one box had been checked. Primary. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. How? If you're trying to convince a lender that your financial situation is stable. She picked up a legal pad. Imagine you're reviewing a loan. I nodded. One applicant still lives in temporary housing. Not ideal. Another applicant has an established primary residence. More stable. She placed the pen down. The difference may not decide the loan, but it influences perception. I slowly understood. Thomas wasn't trying to steal my penthouse. He was trying to make his financial profile look stronger by creating the appearance of residential stability. My home had become part of the story he wanted lenders to believe, and no one had bothered to ask whether I wanted to be part of that story. There's something else. Rachel opened one final folder. I requested this after our meeting yesterday. She slid a draft document across the table. It wasn't signed. It wasn't notarized. Across the top were the words durable financial power of attorney. I stared at the first page. Principal Thomas McDonald. Attorney in fact, Lucas McDonald. I looked up. What is this? A draft. What would it do? It would allow Lucas to act on Thomas's behalf in certain financial matters if Thomas authorized it. Is that unusual? No. Parents appoint adult children all the time. I nodded. So why does this bother you? Rachel turned to page 3. A paragraph had been highlighted. The attorney, in fact, may communicate with lenders, financial institutions, property managers, and other third parties concerning residential or financial matters connected to the principal. I read it twice. Then a third time. Lucas. Property managers. Residential matters. I suddenly remembered something Marcus had said. Lucas had been the one submitting residency paperwork, not Thomas. Rachel watched my expression. You see it? I think I do. If this draft were ever signed, Lucas could continue representing his father's interests. Correct. Using my building. As long as the matters concerned Thomas. I leaned back. Everything still appeared technically legal. Nothing on its own crossed a clear legal line, but together the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. I drove home earlier than usual. Lucas was already there. He looked exhausted. Can we talk? Of course. We sat in the living room. Thomas and Carol had gone out for dinner. For the first time in days, we were alone. Lucas rubbed his forehead. I know things have been tense. They have. I never wanted that. I believe you. He looked relieved. Then I asked quietly, when did you first sign the residency paperwork? His relief disappeared. He looked at the floor. A few weeks ago. Before your parents moved in? Yes. Why, they said it would save time. Save time for what? He hesitated. So everything would already be approved when they arrived. I nodded. And the mailing address. They asked me to help. The financial meetings, I didn't know about those. The bank letters, I didn't know. The consultant, I thought he was helping Dad with retirement. His answers came quickly, too quickly to sound rehearsed, more like someone realizing in real time how many questions he couldn't answer. I asked one more. Did you ever ask why they needed to list this as their primary residence? Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he whispered, no. Later that evening, Lucas walked into the kitchen while I was making tea. I need to tell you something. I looked up. What? He swallowed. A few months ago, I signed another document for Dad. What document? I honestly don't remember. You don't remember? He said it was routine. What did it involve? I didn't read all of it. My chest tightened. What did you sign, Lucas? He looked genuinely ashamed. I trusted him. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. Rachel had sent a scanned copy of another filing she had just obtained. The subject line read, "Possible match found attached," was a partially completed financing package. Across the bottom of one page was a signature I recognized instantly. Lucas McDonald. I didn't show Lucas the email immediately. Instead, I locked my phone and set it face down on the kitchen counter. He was already pale. Whatever he had signed months earlier was beginning to bother him just as much as it bothered me. The difference was that I had learned to verify facts before drawing conclusions. Lucas was just beginning to realize how little he actually knew. He sat across from me. I should have told you sooner. Yes. I honestly thought I was helping. I believe that. He looked surprised. You do? I believe you intended to help your parents. I poured hot water into 2 mugs. But intentions don't erase consequences. He lowered his eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't angry. It was heavy. Marriage has a strange way of teaching you that disappointment is often quieter than rage. The next morning, I met Rachel before work. She already had the newly obtained filing printed and organized. She slid it across the table. I still don't have the complete package, but this is enough. The document came from a commercial lending intermediary. Most of the financial figures had been redacted. Several pages were missing, but one section remained intact. Authorized family representative named Lucas McDonald. I felt my stomach tighten. Rachel pointed to the signature. Is this his? Yes. What authority did this give him? Not ownership. Not borrowing authority. Then what? She folded her hands. It allowed him to communicate with lenders and provide supporting information on behalf of Thomas. So he became part of the application. Exactly. She looked at me carefully. That doesn't automatically make him legally responsible. But it makes him useful. I nodded slowly. Useful. That was the perfect word. Thomas didn't need Lucas to understand every document. He only needed his son to look trustworthy. Rachel continued reading. This application references supporting residency documentation. I leaned forward. What kind? It doesn't say. But the wording is interesting. She highlighted one sentence. Supporting documentation available upon request. I immediately thought about the residency forms, the bank letter, the mailing address, the building records. Individually, they looked harmless. Together, they became supporting documentation. Not for ownership, for credibility. I need to ask you something. Rachel's voice interrupted my thoughts. Has Lucas ever had access to your LLC records? No. Operating agreement? No. Financial statements? No. Digital signatures? Never. She nodded. Good. Why? Because whoever planned this stopped just short of crossing into fraud. That sentence stayed with me. Stopped just short, meaning someone understood where the legal boundary existed and carefully walked alongside it. That evening, I asked Lucas to meet me in the library instead of the living room. It was the only room in the penthouse that still looked exactly the way I'd designed it. No furniture had been moved, no photographs replaced. I closed the door. We need to go through this one step at a time. He nodded. I know. I placed the timeline Rachel and I had assembled on the table. Every event, every document, every email, every visitor, every date. Lucas stared at it. I didn't know all of this. I know. He traced one line with his finger. I signed the residency request here. Yes. A week later, Dad met with that consultant. Yes. Then he changed his mailing address. Yes. He looked at me. I thought those were unrelated. I don't think they were. He leaned back in his chair. For the first time since this began, I watched certainty disappear from his face. I need you to answer one question honestly. I will. When your father asked you to sign documents, what exactly did he tell you? Lucas rubbed both hands together. He said lenders wanted proof that the family was stable. I remained silent. He said after selling their house, everything looked temporary. So he wanted to show stability. Yes. Lucas swallowed. He kept saying banks don't like uncertainty. I thought back to Rachel's explanation. Residential stability, primary residence, supporting documentation, the same words over and over. Not coincidence, a strategy. Lucas continued quietly. He also said something else. What? He told me your penthouse would never actually be involved. I know. He said it was only paperwork. I looked at him. Did you believe him? Yes. He didn't hesitate. I trusted my father. There was no anger in his voice, only embarrassment. I should have read everything. You should have. I know. He covered his face with both hands. I've spent my whole life assuming Dad always knew what he was doing. It was one of the saddest sentences I'd heard him say, because I believed it. Thomas hadn't raised Lucas to question him. He had raised him to comply. The front door opened. Thomas and Carol returned home laughing about dinner. Their conversation stopped the moment they saw us sitting together. Thomas smiled. Everything okay? Lucas stood. We're talking. Thomas looked at him. So talk. Lucas didn't move. I need to ask you something. Thomas shrugged. Go ahead. Why did you need me to sign those financing documents? A flicker crossed Thomas's face. Gone almost instantly. What financing documents? The commercial paperwork. Oh. He waved dismissively. Routine. Rachel had predicted this. Downplay, minimize, normalize. Lucas didn't sit back down. You told me they were routine. They were? Then why didn't you explain them? Thomas laughed softly. Because there wasn't anything to explain. I watched the exchange without saying a word. Thomas wasn't answering questions. He was replacing them. Classic misdirection. Lucas reached into the folder on the table and removed one printed page, the commercial filing Rachel had obtained. I signed this. Thomas glanced at it. Yes. What exactly was I authorizing? You were helping your parents. Doing what? Thomas sighed dramatically. This is what happens when lawyers get involved. Carol stepped forward. Lucas. Her voice softened. You know your father would never hurt you. I'm not asking about me. Lucas looked at both of them. I'm asking about Alina. Carol's expression changed. Only slightly. Enough for me to notice. She hadn't expected him to ask that question. Thomas folded his arms. No one is taking anything from Alina. I hope not. Lucas's voice was calm now. Then answer the question. What question? Why was her address included? Silence. Thomas looked toward Carol. Carol looked back at him. It lasted barely 2 seconds. But after weeks of studying access logs and timelines, I'd become very good at noticing hesitation. Finally, Thomas answered. Because that's where we live. Lucas frowned. You said it was temporary. It is. Then why list it as permanent? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said, sometimes paperwork uses different language. That wasn't an explanation. It was an evasion, and Lucas knew it. I could see it in his face. Thomas finally pushed his chair back. I'm done discussing this. He turned toward the hallway. Before disappearing, he looked directly at Lucas. "You've let your wife fill your head with suspicion." The apartment fell silent after he walked away. Lucas remained standing. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend his father either. He simply looked exhausted. A few minutes later, he quietly said, "I don't think I know my parents as well as I thought." It wasn't a dramatic realization. It sounded more like grief. Around 10 that night, my phone rang. "Rachel, I've got another update." "What happened?" "I searched one more public filing before heading home. And I found a document submitted yesterday." My pulse quickened. "What kind of document?" "It isn't a loan." "It isn't a residency form." She paused. "It's a lender's request asking Thomas to provide additional evidence that his declared primary residence is accurate." I closed my eyes. "They're asking for proof?" "Yes." "What kind of proof?" Rachel took a slow breath. "The request specifically mentions utility records, building verification, and confirmation from the property manager." I read Rachel's email 3 more times after we ended the call. The lender wasn't asking Thomas to prove he owned my penthouse. They were asking him to prove he actually lived there. Utility records, building verification, confirmation from the property manager. The distinction mattered. Ownership had never been the goal. Credibility had. I set my phone down and stared out at the city lights. Thomas hadn't built a plan around stealing my property. He had built one around borrowing my stability. For weeks, he'd been collecting documents that made his life appear more secure than it really was. And without realizing it, Lucas had helped him build that picture. The next morning, Rachel called before I even left for work. "I think we should meet at the bank." "The bank? I can't discuss everything over the phone." 30 minutes later, I was sitting in a small conference room inside the downtown branch. Rachel arrived carrying a slim folder. "I spoke with someone involved in commercial lending." "You know them personally?" "I've worked with them before." "They couldn't disclose confidential information." "I didn't ask them to." She opened the folder. "I asked what kinds of documents lenders usually request in situations like this." She handed me a printed checklist. Proof of identity, business financial statements, tax returns, proof of residence, mailing history, utility records, verification from property management. I recognized every category. Thomas had been trying to collect almost all of them. Rachel tapped the checklist. "None of these documents create ownership." "I understand." "But together they reduce uncertainty." I nodded. "Lenders don't just evaluate numbers. They evaluate risk." "Exactly. If someone appears settled, financially organized, and permanently housed, they're often viewed as a lower risk than someone whose living situation is unstable." Everything suddenly aligned. Thomas's business wasn't failing because of one bad investment. It was struggling to convince lenders that he remained financially dependable. My penthouse had become part of the image he wanted them to see. Rachel reached into her folder again. "I have one more document." It was a copy of a financing package summary. Most of the confidential figures had been blacked out. One section remained visible. Supporting residency document status pending, required before final review. I looked up. "They haven't approved anything." "No. They're waiting." "Exactly. For proof." Rachel nodded. "And that's where your building comes in." I drove directly to meet Marcus. He was already expecting me. I heard from Rachel. "I need to know exactly what information the building has released." Marcus opened my resident profile. "None. Nothing. Nothing beyond confirming receipt of an incomplete application." I finally smiled. "Thank you." He shook his head. "We never verify residency without proper authorization." He paused. "But..." My smile faded. "What? Your father-in-law came back yesterday. What did he want? He asked whether we could issue a residency confirmation letter. I felt my chest tighten. What did you tell him? I said no. Why? Marcus looked almost offended by this question. Because you're the managing member of the ownership entity. He turned his monitor toward me. Our records are clear. Resident authorization required. Managing member approval required. Owner verification required. No one gets a confirmation letter unless you approve it. Relief washed over me. For the first time since this began, someone else's procedures were protecting me as much as my own. Marcus reached into a drawer. I wasn't sure whether I should show you this. He handed me a visitor sign-in sheet. Thomas McDonald. Purpose of visit residency verification. Requested documents. Building occupancy letter. Resident confirmation. Emergency contact verification. Each request had denied stamped beside it. I looked at Marcus. He asked for all of these. Yes. What happened when you refused? Marcus smiled faintly. He wasn't happy. I could imagine the conversation. Thomas had expected routine cooperation. Instead, he'd encountered policy. Policies don't feel guilt. They don't care about family loyalty. They simply require authorization. It was exactly why I trusted systems more than assumptions. That afternoon, Lucas asked if we could meet for lunch. We chose a quiet cafe near his office. He looked exhausted. I barely slept. Neither did I. He wrapped both hands around his coffee. I spoke with Mom. I waited. She says you're making everything bigger than it is. Do you believe her? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he shook his head. I don't know what to believe anymore. That was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. I asked Dad why he needed proof of residency. And he got angry. What did he say? He kept repeating that banks ask for paperwork all the time. That's true. Lucas frowned. But he wouldn't tell me what the paperwork was for. I reached into my bag. I want to show you something. I handed him the lender's checklist Rachel had printed. He read it silently. His eyes stopped at one line. Property manager verification, then another. Proof of primary residence. He looked back at me. This is exactly what Dad asked the building for. I know. His shoulders slowly slumped. He wasn't helping himself. No. He was building a file. Lucas rubbed his forehead. I feel like an idiot. I reached across the table and gently touched his hand. No. He looked surprised. You trusted your father. I should have questioned him. Probably. But trusting your parent isn't stupidity. I let my hand fall back. It's what most children are taught to do. His eyes filled with regret. I brought them into your home. Yes. I gave them access. Yes. I asked you to ignore your instincts. Yes. He swallowed hard. I'm so sorry. For the first time since all of this began, I believed every word. His apology wasn't trying to end the conversation. It wasn't trying to make me forgive him. It simply acknowledged the damage. That evening, I returned home before everyone else. The penthouse felt unusually quiet. I walked into my office and reviewed every document one more time. Then I noticed something I had overlooked. The timestamps. Thomas had requested residency verification from Marcus yesterday morning. The lender's request for additional proof had been issued yesterday morning, within hours. I compared the exact times. The lender requested additional documentation at 9:14 a.m. Thomas visited Marcus at 10:03 a.m. He hadn't been gathering paperwork just in case. He had responded immediately after receiving the lender's request. The sequence confirmed something Rachel and I had suspected for days. Every action Thomas had taken wasn't random. It was reactive. Someone on the other side of the loan process kept asking for more evidence, and Thomas kept trying to supply it. My phone vibrated. A text from Rachel. Check your email. I finally found what connects everything. I opened my inbox. Attached was a newly released public filing from the commercial financing process. The first page contained only routine legal language. The second page stopped me cold. Under current residential status. Thomas had listed only one address, my penthouse. Then beneath that, another line caught my attention. Residence occupied with immediate family member acting as financial representative. The financial representative named on the form was Lucas McDonald. I didn't feel angry when I read the filing. I felt certain. For nearly 3 weeks, I'd been chasing scattered pieces of information, access logs, residency forms, mailing records, visitor logs, bank correspondence. Now they all pointed to the same conclusion. Thomas hadn't been trying to quietly move into my home. He had been trying to quietly strengthen a financial narrative. And that narrative depended on one assumption, that I would continue saying nothing. I closed my laptop and called Rachel. I think it's time. I agree. No more waiting. No. Her voice was calm. We've collected enough facts. So what's our next step? We don't argue with Thomas. We don't negotiate. We simply enforce your rights. At 9 o'clock that morning, Rachel, Marcus, and I met in the building's management office. Marcus already had several documents prepared. The first was the ownership profile for my penthouse. Owner McDonald Technology Holdings, LLC. Managing member Alina McDonald. Authorized resident approval managing member only. The second document listed every active credential connected to the unit. Most belonged to me. A few belonged to Lucas. 3 temporary credentials had already expired because I'd disabled them on the night I came home. Rachel looked at Marcus. Can any permanent resident be added today without Ms. McDonald's approval? No. Can anyone request administrator access? No. Can anyone receive building verification as a resident? No. Marcus smiled politely. Our system won't process any of those requests. Rachel nodded. Good. Then she turned to me. Let's finish this. I opened the administrative dashboard on my laptop. Every permission associated with the apartment appeared in front of me. Lucas's access remained active. Everything connected to Thomas and Carol had already been suspended. Rachel pointed toward the screen. I'd also revoked guest management privileges. I clicked. Disabled. Garage authorization. Disabled. Mailroom authorization. Disabled. Visitor invitation privileges. Disabled. Shared device registration. Disabled. Each confirmation window disappeared one after another. I wasn't locking anyone out of spite. I was restoring the system to exactly what it had been before someone else started rewriting the rules. When I finished, the dashboard displayed one simple message. Administrative permissions updated successfully. Rachel smiled. That's your first boundary. Marcus printed another document. Notice of unauthorized residency application. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't an eviction. It simply stated that all previous residency requests had been withdrawn because they lacked authorization from the managing member. Rachel reviewed the wording. Perfect. She handed me a pen. I signed. Marcus stamped the form. The sound echoed through the small office. It was strangely satisfying, not because I had defeated someone, because everything was finally back inside the proper process. Around noon, Marcus called upstairs. Mr. McDonald is requesting access to the management office. Rachel looked at me. You don't have to speak with him. I want to. A few minutes later, Thomas walked in. Carol followed close behind. Lucas arrived last. Thomas smiled the moment he saw me. "I've been looking for you." "I know." Marcus remained behind the reception desk. Rachel stayed beside me. Thomas glanced at the papers on the table. "What's all this?" Rachel answered before I could. "Administrative updates." Thomas frowned. "What kind of updates?" "The kind the managing member is entitled to make." For the first time since I'd known him, Thomas's confidence slipped. "Managing member." I slid the LLC operating agreement across the table. "You've never seen this before." He looked down. The first page clearly identified the owner. McDonald Technology Holdings, LLC, managing member Alina McDonald. Rachel spoke evenly. "This residence isn't jointly managed. It isn't subject to approval by family members. It isn't governed by household consensus. It is governed by the operating agreement." Thomas looked at Lucas. "You never mentioned this." Lucas didn't answer because he hadn't known, not until Rachel explained everything to us. Thomas straightened his jacket. "This is unnecessary." "No." I kept my voice calm. "It's overdue." He laughed once. "We've been living upstairs. You've been staying as guests. We're family. Guests can also be family." Carol stepped forward. "Alina, surely we can solve this privately." "We are." "There was never any reason to involve lawyers." Rachel smiled politely. "I wasn't involved because of family. I was involved because paperwork was." The room fell quiet. Carol looked at Lucas. "Are you really letting this happen?" Lucas closed his eyes briefly before answering. "I should have listened to Alina." Neither of his parents spoke. That single sentence changed the atmosphere more than any legal document. For the first time, Lucas wasn't standing between us. He was standing beside the truth. Thomas finally raised his voice. "This is unbelievable. I've spent my whole life providing for my family. No one disputes that. And this is how we're treated," I answered softly. "No, this is how unauthorized requests are treated." He looked stunned. Not because I'd insulted him, because I hadn't. There was nothing emotional for him to argue against. Only procedures, only records, only facts. He turned toward Marcus. "I want written confirmation that I've been living here." Marcus shook his head. "I can't provide that." "I've received mail here." "Receiving mail doesn't authorize residency." "I've stayed here for weeks." "That doesn't change ownership records." "I need documentation." Marcus remained perfectly professional. "I can only issue documents approved by the managing member." Thomas looked at me. "You'd really refuse?" "Yes." He stared at me for several seconds. Then he asked the question I'd been expecting since this all began. "So that's it? You're throwing your husband's parents out?" I met his eyes. "No. I'm ending access that was never properly granted." The difference mattered. One was punishment. The other was a boundary. Thomas's face hardened. "You'll regret humiliating your family." I answered quietly. "I didn't embarrass anyone. The paperwork did." Rachel gathered every signed document into her folder. "We're finished here." Thomas stood motionless. He had expected emotion. Instead, he had encountered policy. He had expected guilt. Instead, he had encountered documentation. He had expected Lucas to defend him. Instead, his son remained silent. As we walked toward the elevator, Lucas caught up beside me. "I need to ask one favor." I looked at him. "Can I see everything?" "What do you mean?" "Every document. Every timeline. Every email." "I need to understand exactly how this happened." I studied his face. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't asking me to trust him. He was asking for the truth. "I'll show you everything." That evening, Rachel reserved a conference room at her office so we could review every piece of evidence together. Before leaving the building, she handed me one final envelope. "It arrived this afternoon." "What is it?" "A response from the lender." I opened it. The first sentence read, "The refinancing application has been suspended due to insufficient verification of the applicant's declared primary residence." The envelope stayed unopened on the conference table for nearly a minute, not because I was afraid of what it said, because I already knew. Rachel had summarized the first sentence over the phone. The refinancing application had been suspended. Not denied, not approved. Suspended. That distinction mattered. A suspended application could sometimes move forward if the missing documentation was later provided. Rachel understood exactly what I was thinking. They may try again. I know. But not with your penthouse. She nodded. Not after today. Lucas arrived 10 minutes later. He looked like he hadn't slept. There were dark circles under his eyes, and for the first time since we'd been married, he looked uncertain before walking into a room with me. "I almost turned around twice." "I wondered if you would." "I almost did." He pulled out a chair. "But I owe you this." Rachel closed the conference room door. "No interruptions. No assumptions. We're simply reviewing facts." Lucas nodded. "That's fair." I placed the timeline in front of him. It stretched across almost the entire table. Every document sat in chronological order. The access logs, the residency application, the change of address requests, the visitor records, the bank letter, the financial consultation, the draft power of attorney, the lender checklist, the suspended refinancing notice. Rachel slid the first document toward Lucas. "Let's start here." He recognized his own signature immediately. "I remember this one." "What were you told?" "Dad said building management needed it before Mom and Dad could stay with us." Rachel made a note. "No discussion about financing, no. No discussion about lenders, no." She moved to the next document, the change of address request. "Did you know this had been submitted?" Lucas stared at it. "No." "The bank letter." He shook his head. "No." "The meetings with David Mercer." "I thought he was Dad's retirement advisor." Rachel looked at me briefly. Exactly what we had expected. Lucas hadn't been hiding information. He had never had it. We continued for nearly 2 hours. Every answer Lucas gave fit the timeline. Nothing contradicted the evidence. Instead, every response revealed the same pattern. Thomas gave him only enough information to obtain another signature, another approval, another favor. Never the complete picture. Eventually, Lucas leaned back in his chair. "I've spent my entire life believing my father would never manipulate me." No one answered. He continued quietly. "I think he convinced himself he wasn't." Rachel folded her hands. "People often justify their own decisions." Lucas looked at her. "So he believed he was protecting the family?" "Possibly. Even if it meant using mine." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. I finally opened the lender's letter. Most of it contained standard business language. Then I reached the final paragraph. Additional verification submitted by the applicant was determined to be insufficient to establish the declared primary residence. Accordingly, further review has been suspended pending materially different supporting documentation. I handed the letter to Lucas. He read it twice. "So," he looked up, "this whole thing failed because they couldn't prove Dad actually lived with us." Rachel corrected him gently. "No, it failed because they couldn't prove what they claimed." That difference mattered. Truth wasn't determined by how many papers someone collected. It depended on whether those papers accurately reflected reality. Lucas remained silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke.
I need to tell you something.
I waited. I confronted Dad this afternoon.
You did, before coming here. What happened?
He laughed once, without humor.
He told me I was choosing my wife over my parents. And, I told him I was choosing honesty.
He rubbed his forehead.
He said I was abandoning my family.
I looked at him.
What did you say? I told him,
he swallowed, that asking questions isn't abandonment. No one spoke. Rachel quietly closed her notebook. She understood that this part wasn't about legal strategy anymore. It was about family.
I owe you an apology.
Lucas turned toward me. A real one.
You already apologized. Not like this.
His voice shook slightly. I kept asking you to compromise.
I know.
I kept telling you they were only trying to settle in.
I know.
I kept acting like your instincts were the problem. I didn't interrupt him. You trusted evidence.
I trusted assumptions.
He looked down at his hands.
I didn't protect our marriage. I protected my parents from uncomfortable questions.
His honesty hurt. Mostly because I'd wanted to hear those words weeks earlier, before trust had broken, before lawyers became involved, before timelines replaced conversations.
I forgive you.
Lucas looked up immediately.
You do?
I forgive the man who believed his parents. His shoulders relaxed. Then I continued.
But forgiveness isn't the same thing as rebuilding.
The relief disappeared from his face.
I know. I don't think you do.
He listened.
I can believe you're sorry.
I do.
I can believe you never intended to hurt me.
I didn't.
But I also know something else.
What? The person I married would have asked me before changing my home. He closed his eyes.
I know.
The person I married would have questioned anyone asking for my trust without explanation.
I know.
The person I married disappeared one signature at a time. He nodded slowly. Every sentence landed because none of them exaggerated. They were simply true. Rachel quietly stood. I'll give you both some privacy. She left the conference room. Lucas and I remained where we were. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked,
What happens now?
I looked through the window toward the Chicago skyline.
I think we stop pretending this can go back to normal.
He didn't argue.
I was hoping you'd say counseling. I've already spent weeks trying to repair something while I was still being asked to ignore facts.
He lowered his head.
I understand. I don't hate you.
I know, but I don't trust you with my boundaries anymore. Those words hurt both of us because they weren't spoken in anger. Only acceptance. The following morning, Rachel emailed the final set of legal documents she had prepared. There was no dramatic lawsuit, no demand for damages, no attempt to punish Thomas or Carol, only straightforward paperwork. Withdrawal of all unauthorized residency requests. Formal notice confirming that no residency authorization had ever been granted. Updated access records, and one final document. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I read every page carefully, then I signed my name. Not because I wanted revenge, because I finally understood something I had resisted admitting. A marriage cannot survive when one spouse repeatedly asks the other to surrender clear boundaries for the sake of keeping peace. Less than an hour after Rachel filed the paperwork electronically, my phone rang. It was Thomas. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call. Then another. Finally, a text message appeared. You're destroying this family over paperwork. I looked at the screen for several seconds before locking my phone. No. The paperwork had only revealed what had been happening all along. The divorce was finalized a little over 4 months later. There were no dramatic courtroom arguments, no shouting in hallways, no relatives choosing sides outside the courthouse. In many ways, it ended the same way our marriage had begun to unravel, with document signatures and quiet decisions. Sometimes people imagine that the end of a marriage must arrive with one explosive moment. Mine didn't. It arrived through a long series of small choices that slowly revealed we no longer understood trust the same way. Lucas never contested the divorce. In fact, he made one request through our attorneys. He wanted the process to stay respectful. I agreed. There was nothing left to fight over. The Penthouse had always belonged to McDonald Technology Holdings, LLC. The operating agreement had protected it exactly as it was designed to do. Every residency request connected to Thomas and Carol had already been withdrawn. The building's records reflected only one authorized resident: me. Marcus called a few days after the paperwork became final. I thought you'd like to know. What is it? We completed every update. What kind of updates? Your access system. I smiled. I was planning to review it myself. You'll still want to. He laughed. But I think you'll appreciate this. He emailed a summary while we spoke. Every temporary credential had been permanently deleted. Every inactive profile had been removed. Visitor permissions had been reset. Emergency contacts had been updated. Administrative authority remained exactly where it had always belonged. I opened the dashboard. For the first time in months, there were no unfamiliar names, no pending requests, no unexplained notifications, only a clean system. Strangely, that made me emotional. Not because of the technology, because it reflected my life. No hidden permissions, no quiet compromises, no one rewriting boundaries while hoping I wouldn't notice. About a month later, I heard from Rachel again. Not as my attorney, as someone checking in. How are you sleeping? Better. Working too much. I laughed. A little. That's familiar. We met for lunch near her office. She asked whether I'd heard anything else about Thomas. Very little. She nodded. I did. What happened? The refinancing never moved forward. I wasn't surprised. Without the residency documentation he'd been trying to build, the application simply remained incomplete. Rachel stirred her iced tea. Eventually, he had to restructure the business another way. Did he lose everything? No. I appreciated that answer more than I expected. What happened? He sold several commercial assets. She paused. It wasn't easy. But he solved his own financial problems. I sat quietly. For weeks, I had imagined what justice would look like. At one point, I thought justice meant exposing Thomas. Later, I thought it meant winning. Now I realized justice had been something much simpler. His financial responsibilities remained his. Mine remained mine. The boundaries were finally where they belonged. Lucas wrote to me about 6 weeks after the divorce. Not by text, not through social media. He mailed a handwritten letter. Rachel had once told me handwritten letters usually mattered because they forced people to slow down. She was right. Lucas didn't ask me to come back. He didn't ask for another chance. He simply wrote, I've started therapy. For the first time, I'm learning the difference between respecting my parents and surrendering my own judgment. I wish I had learned that while we were still married. Thank you for showing me what boundaries actually look like, even though I didn't appreciate them at the time. I'm truly sorry. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because I wanted to forget it, because it had finally become part of the past. Life became surprisingly ordinary after that. I kept my morning walks along the Chicago River. I spent weekends reading instead of answering unnecessary phone calls. I hosted dinners again. Friends who had quietly given us space during the divorce slowly returned. One Friday evening, my closest friend Emma looked around the penthouse and smiled. "It feels different." I laughed. "I changed almost nothing." She shook her head. "You changed one thing." "What?" "The atmosphere." I looked around. The artwork hadn't moved. The furniture was in the same place. Even the coffee station sat exactly where I'd originally designed it. Then I understood what she meant. The apartment no longer felt like a place I had to defend. It simply felt like home again. As the sun began to set, I stepped onto the balcony with a cup of coffee. The Chicago skyline stretched across the horizon, glowing gold beneath the evening light. Months earlier, I'd stood in the same place, wondering how my own home had begun to feel unfamiliar. Now it felt peaceful. Not because everything in my life had worked out perfectly, but because I had stopped confusing peace with permission. I used to believe setting boundaries meant risking relationships. Now I understood something different. Healthy relationships don't disappear because someone establishes reasonable boundaries. Only unhealthy expectations do. I didn't lose my home. I didn't even lose my ability to trust. I simply became more careful about where I placed that trust. Looking back, disabling those access codes on my phone that first night wasn't really the moment I reclaimed my penthouse. It was the moment I reclaimed my voice. And that turned out to be worth far more than any piece of real estate ever could. When someone you love asks you to ignore your own instincts for the sake of keeping the family happy, it's easy to wonder if you're being selfish for asking questions. Many of us are taught that kindness means saying yes, staying quiet, or avoiding conflict, but healthy relationships are not built on silent sacrifices that slowly erase your sense of security. Boundaries are not acts of revenge. They are acts of clarity. They don't exist to punish people. They exist to define where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. You can forgive someone for the choices they made without giving them the same access to your life that allowed those choices to happen in the first place. If you've ever felt guilty for protecting your peace, remember that respect cannot survive where consent is ignored. The strongest relationships are those where trust is earned, communication is honest, and boundaries are honored, not negotiated away through guilt or pressure. If this story reminded you of your own experience, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your story may help someone else who is struggling to choose peace over people-pleasing. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family justice, healing, and quiet strength, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined us for the next one. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.